I feel it necessary to state at the outset that I don't watch very much anime, to the point where I can count the number of films or series I've seen on one hand, and it might actually be less than that. Needless to say, that means I'm no anime expert or connoisseur. A large part of this comes down to my age, as I'm significantly older than the normal target demographic for anime, and I simply didn't grow up with either the internet or anime being widely available. And I say this to at least give some background to explain my initial resistance to watching Cyberpunk Edgerunners. That, coupled by the fact that I had not touched Cyberpunk 2077 in nigh on 2 years, made it a difficult sell for me. And yet one person after the other kept telling me about it, until I eventually caved in, expecting little to nothing. I managed to watch all 10 episodes over the course of 2 days, and all my apprehension and reluctance seemed in retrospect to have been unjustified. To be sure, Edgerunners is a great series, but with the revelation that my reluctance to watch it was unjustified, so too came the revelation of its flaws. Which is to say, I enjoyed it a great deal, but not without reservations. Edgerunners has as a company one David Martinez on his rise and fall in the dystopian landscape of cyberpunk in Night City in the year 2076. But you would at least partly be mistaken to believe that Edgerunners is in fact about David Martinez, or even the other characters in the series. Cyberpunk, as it is envisioned by Mike Pondsmith in its incarnation in Edgerunners, and the game of Cyberpunk 2077, is fundamentally distinct from many other genres and settings, in that other settings are characterized by a certain flavor and ambiance, such as the high fantasy of the Forgotten Realms in D&D, a setting I talk about frequently, or Star Trek setting of the future of humanity in space. But Cyberpunk, as envisioned by Mike Pondsmith, and realized in its products, in particular Edgerunners and Cyberpunk 2077, isn't just a setting with a certain flavor and ambiance. Rather, it is a setting that is governed by immutable laws that affect every story told within it, which leads to an unfortunate uniformity in outcome. What distinguishes flavor from law in this context is that flavor allows for a setting to set the stage for a story to be told, for characters to develop in it, and depending on the context, for them to appropriately rise and fall. Normally, a setting merely provides a framework for this development rather than acting as a straitjacket. Cyberpunk, for reasons we can discuss later, is not just flavor. Rather, it represents a fundamental commitment to a dystopian vision of the future, a world where things only have the most superficial appearance of being better, above all in matters technical. But the shiny surface serves only to cover out the underlying reality of a modern hellscape, where life is cheap and death is casual. The one true, immutable axiom of cyberpunk is that everyone loses. There can never be a triumph or a success that is not at least heavily marred and scarred by failure and loss. And this is true for every single character in Edgerunners. There has been criticism of the series that suggests that it could have benefited from more exposition, effectively meaning more episodes in which all of the important characters get their due. Maine, for example, serves as a kind of father figure to David, who undoubtedly seeks to emulate him in his striving to achieve greatness as a cyberpunk. And yet we know little about him. Kiwi, the shady and detached netrunner that ultimately betrays her gang, has zero exposition, and we do not understand any of her motivations beyond the most surface-level treatment. Rebecca is yet another favorite of the fans, but we know next to nothing about her, and even David and Lucy, arguably the stars of Edgerunners, who've received by far the most exposition of all the characters, are still lacking in many important respects. But let's just assume that there had been 12 or even 16 episodes. Let's assume that, and I can tell you, it still wouldn't have mattered. Let's at least have a look at David's character development, since he is the main character of the series. I'm going to argue that David really does not have any character development. We learn early on that he does not possess a dream of his own, and that he's effectively a lost soul. Fair enough. He attended the expensive academy at his mother's behest because she wanted him to climb the corporate ladder, but he had no genuine interest in it. He found Maine impressive and worthy of following, and ultimately followed in his footsteps, but this was far more about peer acceptance than anything else, wanting to fit in as well as achieving notoriety. And he at least nominally talked himself into taking on Lucy's dream of flying to the moon, and attempted to convince Lucy that she had sold him on the dream as well. David does climb the hierarchy of the Edgerunner, becoming a true cyberpunk, but it's questionable as to how much this was truly his dream, and more than anything else, it came off as something he was doing because there appeared to be little else available to him in terms of an alternative. Now don't misunderstand me, David is an incredibly sympathetic character, which is why his fall and death is that much more impactful but he's not a character who truly matters or changes. Time might pass, and he might get older, but there's no fundamental change in David, and this, of course, is essential to the point of the plot. Because in the cyberpunk context, potential character development will necessarily be squelched by the setting itself, as the design and philosophy of cyberpunk demand it. This is made manifest as we visit one of the recurring themes of Edgerunners, and indeed cyberpunk, the theme of cyberpsychosis, which is a mental breakdown that occurs in response to the inability of the human body and mind to handle excessive amounts of cyber augmentation, driving the individual afflicted by it insane, and invariably ending in violent death as the individual in question loses his mind and goes on a rampage, and law enforcement is called in. Officially, there's no explanation for cyberpsychosis, but everyone with a brain can see that only individuals with excessive cyber augmentation succumb to it, and thus a connection between cyberpsychosis and extreme cyberware is obvious. In Edgerunners, the series opens up with a depiction of a cyber psycho who is using the Sandevistan, an operating system that enhances one's speed, strength, and reflexes, and is prophetic, because this Sandevistan system ultimately ends up in the hands of David Martinez. Although David demonstrates extraordinary resilience and resistance to cyberware augmentation, his resistance is not without limits, and David and the audience receive numerous warning signs in the form of cyber psychos they encounter, perhaps most importantly from his mentor, Maine. Yet David convinces himself that this fate won't befall him, despite not just external warning signs, but signs that his own body is giving into it, and admonitions from multiple characters to slow down and even reduce the amount of augments he is using. And yet, he just decides to YOLO it and commit himself to a death sentence, in spite of the obvious signs of mental and physical decay. Why does this happen? It happens because this is cyberpunk, and everyone loses, and this is most readily apparent in the main character, David Martinez, whose entire narrative has been created to accommodate the inevitable loss of his life, but perhaps more importantly, the people that made his life worth living. Even characters such as Adam Smasher, who seemingly ended up on top, upon closer inspection and a different form of interpretation, actually have lost. So whilst it's true that Adam Smasher probably cares little for his forsaken humanity, he is, at the end of the day, just a glorified lapdog for Arasaka, existing at Arasaka's behest and by its grace. And it all reminds me of that iconic scene from Cyberpunk 2077, after all the struggle, fighting, self-reflection, and internal conflict.
I don't know. A happier ending for everyone involved. Here, for folks like us, wrong city, wrong people.
And we are constantly reminded of this, as Lucy tells David, you don't make a name for yourself as a cyberpunk by how you live. You make a name by how you die. It's not the life or the end you deserve. Lucy explicitly tells David she does not want him to die on her. And despite all the warnings, the admonitions, the pleas, the whips and scorns of time, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, almost as if robotically, David resigns himself to death and destruction, all the while deluding himself that he in fact is living for Lucy's dream, telling her as much even as he condemns himself to a final death in the same breath, seemingly incapable of grasping that Lucy's dream had in fact been to have him by her side in life and to visit the moon together. But this is cyberpunk, and no one gets what they want. Ever. I would call it Sisyphean, but Sisyphus, we are told, ultimately found some contentment in the futility of his actions. And I get that this is the nature of Night City in cyberpunk, and yet that same constraint prevents genuine character development, and perhaps, what is most important in any fictional setting, the spark of hope of something better, no matter how fractional or small. When writers cleave to the laws of a fictional setting, as if they were axiomatic and absolutely necessary, disallowing for any exceptions, that setting is robbed of something. The laws of cyberpunk dictate that all those who want something out of life must falter and die. But there could be opportunities to very occasionally break those laws and rebel against the dark powers that govern that place. There could, in fact, have been a different version of David, who, in the course of the series, had gained wisdom, prudence, and appreciation of what was ultimately valuable to him, Lucy and his crew. He could have decided to dechrome and scale back, having learnt a valuable lesson from Maine, and listened to all those who'd been warning him, and virtually all the same events could have unfolded, just as they did, save that in the end, if only by the skin of their teeth, Lucy and David escape and they both make it to the moon, stronger, wiser, having defied the gods of cyberpunk, perhaps happy in the end, if only for a little while. All the loss and tragedy loses its meaning if there's nothing to be gained from it. And though I can fully understand being morbidly attached to the dystopian vision of cyberpunk, and can even appreciate it at times, there have to be at least occasional loopholes in the law. That loss and suffering could very occasionally be instructive rather than destructive. But sadly, that is not meant to be, which guarantees every vision of any story realized in the cyberpunk universe to be one of ultimate futility and loss, and that is the fundamental difference between a setting which sets the stage for a story and offers constraints versus one that crushes everyone and everything into that setting, where plot and character development are axiomatically dictated by the setting rather than the circumstances within that setting. Every character in cyberpunk wears a straitjacket, because that is how it's intended to be. You could truly have the whole kit and caboodle without losing anything of the dystopian vision of cyberpunk, if only just a little of resistance to the commandment of thou shalt lose and fail were offered, learning from the mistakes and tragedy of dystopian cyberpunk in Night City to snatch some small victory from the jaws of defeat. We are told that cyberpunk is meant to be a warning for us of how things might be in the future, a future devoutly to be avoided, and that's not a bad thing at all, even as we hurtle towards that future in our own existence outside of the cyberpunk fiction. But that does not mean that everything in that world we seek to avoid needs to be predictably desolate and hopeless. Quite the opposite. The strivings of the little people will fail 99% of the time. But just once in a blue moon, we ought to be able to catch a glimmer of hope. And that was a potential that Edgerunners, as much as I liked it, clearly missed out on. And it is our loss, but perhaps more importantly, David and Lucy's. If you enjoyed this content, do let me know in the comment section, and consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Till the next time, take care.